The grand ballroom glittered, a universe of crystal and champagne. But for Selene, it was a cold, airless planet. Each polite smile she offered felt like a crack in a dam, holding back a flood of unshed tears. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, a silent promise to the new life within, a life her husband, Victor, seemed to have forgotten. Then she saw her, Juliana, Victor's protégée, draped in crimson silk, her laughter a shard of glass aimed directly at Celine's heart. The mockery in her eyes was unmistakable, a cruel, private joke in a room full of strangers. The Thornton Grand Ballroom was a symphony of opulence, a testament to the city's elite who gathered for the annual Starlight charity gala. Crystal chandeliers, like frozen waterfalls, cascaded from the frescoed ceiling, their light refracting through 1,000 champagne flutes. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hothouse flowers, hummed with the low murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of jewelry. To the outside world, this was the pinnacle of success, a glittering tableau of wealth and philanthropy. But for Selene, 6 months pregnant and standing on the arm of her husband, Victor Blackwood, it was a beautifully constructed cage. Victor was a master of this universe. With his impeccably tailored tuxedo, a smile that could disarm titans of industry, and a charisma that filled any room he entered, he was the sun around which this glittering solar system revolved. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, his hand resting possessively on the small of Celine's back. But the touch, once a source of comfort and security, now felt like a brand, a public declaration of ownership that masked a private, chilling neglect. Selene adjusted the deep sapphire silk of her maternity gown, the fabric chosen to complement Victor's public image, not her own comfort. The baby, their baby, shifted within her, a tiny, insistent flutter that was both a comfort and a painful reminder of what was at stake. She had once dreamed of this moment, of attending such events with Victor, her hand on their child, a family united and celebrated. But the dream had curdled, soured by months of hushed phone calls, late nights at the office, and a growing emotional chasm between them that no amount of shared wealth could bridge. Her eyes scanned the room, a practiced, reflexive search for the source of her anxiety. And then she saw her, Juliana Thorne. She stood near the marble fountain, a vision in a crimson dress that clung to her slender frame like a second skin. Her fiery red hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and her laughter, loud and musical, drew the attention of a small circle of admirers. Juliana was Victor's newest protégée, a rising star in his financial empire, a woman whose ambition was as striking as her beauty. But Selene knew with the gut-wrenching certainty of a woman betrayed that Juliana's role in Victor's life extended far beyond the boardroom. Juliana's eyes, the color of jade, met Selene's across the crowded room. A slow, deliberate smile spread across her lips. It wasn't a smile of greeting, it was a smile of ownership, a triumphant, mocking smirk that sent a chill down Selene's spine. In that single, silent exchange, Juliana communicated everything. I know your husband better than you do. I share his secrets, his passions, his bed. You are just the wife, the vessel for his heir, and your time is running out. Selene's breath hitched. She turned to Victor, a desperate plea in her eyes. Victor, I'm not feeling well. Can we please go home? He barely glanced at her, his attention fixed on a portly-looking man with a booming laugh. Nonsense, darling. You look radiant. The press is here. We need to make an appearance. Just a little longer. He squeezed her hand, a perfunctory gesture devoid of warmth, before turning back to his conversation, dismissing her as easily as he would an errant servant. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet she had never felt more alone. These were Victor's friends, his colleagues, his world. She was just an accessory, the pregnant wife who played her part, who smiled for the cameras and pretended not to see the whispers that followed her like shadows. She remembered a time when Victor's world had been her world, when his laughter had been a genuine reflection of shared joy, not a performance for a captive audience. They had met in college, a whirlwind romance built on late-night study sessions, shared dreams, and a belief that their love could conquer anything. Victor had been ambitious, even then, But his ambition had been tempered by a tenderness, a vulnerability that only she was allowed to see. Now that vulnerability was gone, replaced by a hardened, polished veneer that she could no longer penetrate. The man who had once quoted poetry to her under a canopy of stars was now a man who measured success in stock prices and public appearances. And she, who had been his confidant, his partner, his equal, had been relegated to the role of a beautiful, pregnant prop. A wave of nausea, unrelated to her pregnancy, washed over her. She excused herself, her voice a near whisper that Victor didn't even register, and made her way towards the powder room, her hand protectively cradling her belly. As she passed the fountain, Juliana deliberately stepped into her path, her crimson dress a slash of defiance against the muted tones of the room. "Selene, darling," Juliana purred, her voice dripping with faux concern. "You look a little pale. Are you sure you're up for this? The stress of these events can be so taxing, especially in your condition." She let her gaze drift pointedly down to Selene's swollen abdomen, a flicker of something cruel and triumphant in her eyes. "I'm fine, Juliana," Selene replied, her voice colder than she intended. She tried to step around her, but Juliana shifted, blocking her path once more. "It's just that Victor worries so much about you," Juliana continued, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "He tells me everything. He says you've been so fragile lately. He needs a strong woman by his side, especially now, with the merger. He needs someone who can keep up." The implication was clear, a poisoned dart aimed with precision. "He needs me, not you." The air crackled with unspoken animosity. The polite chatter of the Gala faded into a distant hum, and for a moment it was just the two of them, the wife and the mistress, locked in a silent, brutal battle in the heart of the gilded cage. Selene's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped and desperate for escape. But there was no escape, not yet. The performance had to continue. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she lifted her chin, met Juliana's venomous gaze, and held it, a silent declaration that she would not be so easily broken. The night, she knew, was far from over. The powder room was a sanctuary of marble and gold, a stark, silent contrast to the cacophony of the ballroom. Selene leaned against the cool, smooth surface of the vanity, her reflection a pale, haunted stranger in the ornate mirror. The woman looking back at her had shadows under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and a tension around her mouth that spoke of weeks, months, of silent, gnawing anxiety. She splashed her face with cold water, the shock of it a welcome distraction from the turmoil in her mind. Juliana's words echoed in her ears, each one a carefully crafted chisel chipping away at her composure. "He tells me everything." The claim was both a boast and a threat, a stake driven through the heart of her marriage. Had Victor truly confided in this woman? Had he shared his fears, his dreams, the intimate details of their life together? The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She remembered a time when she was the one he turned to, the one who knew the man behind the carefully constructed public persona. Now it seemed she was just another part of the facade. Her mind, a traitorous archive, began to replay the evidence she had tried so desperately to ignore. The late-night texts that were hastily deleted, the scent of an unfamiliar, expensive perfume clinging to his shirts, the business trips that stretched for days, with calls that were brief and impersonal. Each memory was a small, sharp stone, and together they formed a mountain of betrayal that threatened to crush her. The root of her vulnerability, the source of her desperate need to believe in Victor, despite the mounting evidence, was a trauma she had buried deep within her, a ghost from her past that still whispered to her in the dead of night. Years ago, before Victor, she had been engaged to another man, a man whose charm had masked a possessive, controlling nature. The relationship had ended in a fire, a literal one, that had destroyed her small apartment and nearly claimed her life. She had escaped with minor burns, but the emotional scars ran deep. The investigation had ruled it an accident, faulty wiring, but a small, terrified part of her had always suspected he had set it, a final, terrifying act of possession. Victor had been her savior. He had found her broken, fragile, and afraid to trust. He had been patient, kind, and fiercely protective. He had built a fortress around her, a world of security and luxury where nothing could ever hurt her again. And she, in her gratitude and her love, had willingly locked herself inside. She had given him her trust, her heart, her very soul. She had allowed herself to become dependent on him, to see herself through his eyes. And now the fortress had become a prison, and her savior, her jailer. A knock on the door startled her from her reverie. "Selene, are you in there?" It was an acquaintance, the wife of one of Victor's business partners. Selene forced a smile, pasting the mask of the serene, happy wife back into place. "I'm fine, Catherine. Just needed a moment." She opened the door, the glittering world of the Gala rushing back in to assault her senses. As she made her way back to Victor's side, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The whispers which she had once dismissed as idle gossip now seemed to follow her, a sibilant, serpentine hiss that coiled around her, suffocating her. "Did you hear about Victor and his new assistant? She's so ambitious. Poor Selene. She looks exhausted." She reached Victor, who was now holding court with the senator and his wife. He smiled, slipping his arm around her waist, pulling her back into the tableau. "There you are, darling. I was just telling Senator Thompson about our trip to Monaco." He launched into an anecdote, his voice smooth and confident, but Selene was no longer listening. She was watching Juliana, who had now positioned herself at the edge of the group, her gaze fixed on Victor. There was a possessiveness in her look, an intimacy that was far more damning than any whispered rumor. She would subtly nod in agreement with Victor's points, her smile mirroring his, as if they were sharing a private, silent conversation. And Victor, consciously or not, played to her, his eyes flicking to her for approval, for a reaction. The room began to spin. The glittering lights, the smiling faces, the endless chatter, it all blurred into a dizzying, overwhelming vortex. Selene's hand tightened on Victor's arm, her nails digging into the fine wool of his tuxedo. He faltered for a moment, his smile tightening. "Selene, are you all right?" he murmured, his voice low, a hint of irritation in his tone. "I need some air," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now, Victor, please!" For the first time that evening, he seemed to see her, truly see the distress in her eyes. Perhaps it was the fear of a public scene, of his pregnant wife fainting in front of a senator, that finally spurred him to action. With a curt apology, he guided her through the crowd, his grip on her arm now firm, almost painful. They stepped out onto a secluded balcony, the cool night air a blessed relief against her fevered skin. The city sprawled beneath them, a river of light and shadow. It was a beautiful view, but it offered no comfort. "What is wrong with you tonight, Selene?" Victor's voice was sharp, the pretense of the doting husband stripped away now that they were in private. "You're making a scene." "A scene?" she repeated, her voice rising with a hysterical edge she couldn't control. "Victor, did you see the way she looked at me? Did you hear what she said?" He sighed, a long, exasperated sound as he ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Juliana, what are you talking about? You're being paranoid. She's my protégée, that's all. You're pregnant, emotional. You're not thinking clearly." It was his go-to excuse, the one he used to dismiss her concerns, to invalidate her feelings. It was a form of gaslighting so subtle, so practiced, that she had almost started to believe it herself. But not tonight. Tonight, the mockery in Juliana's eyes had been too blatant, the whispers too loud, the ache in her own heart too profound. "Don't you dare use my pregnancy against me," she shot back, her voice shaking with a rage that surprised them both. "I am not paranoid, Victor. I am not stupid. I know something is going on between you and her." He stared at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt? Regret? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, hard mask of indifference. "You're tired," he said, his voice flat, final. "We'll go home soon, but you will pull yourself together, go back inside, and you will smile. Do you understand me, Selene? You will not ruin this night for me." The command was absolute, the threat unspoken, but hanging heavy in the air between them. "You will not defy me." He turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving her alone on the balcony, the whispers and shadows her only companions. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to a heart that was not just breaking, but shattering. Returning to the ballroom was like diving back into a shark-infested sea after a brief, desperate gasp for air. The mask was back in place, the smile fixed, but inside, Selene was a maelstrom of raw, wounded emotion. Victor's ultimatum on the balcony had been a declaration of war, a clear signal that her feelings were an inconvenience, a threat to the perfect image he so carefully cultivated. She was no longer his partner, but his subject, and she was expected to obey. She stood by his side, a silent, beautiful automaton, as he networked and charmed his way through the rest of the evening. She accepted condolences for her illness, offered gracious smiles, and placed a hand on her belly as if in a gesture of maternal bliss, when in reality it was a shield, a desperate attempt to protect her unborn child from the toxicity that filled the air. The main event of the evening was Victor's keynote address. As the co-chair of the gala, he was scheduled to speak about the importance of philanthropy and announce his company's multi-million-dollar donation to the Children's Hospital. It was the moment he had been preparing for, the pinnacle of his public performance. As the master of ceremonies introduced him, a wave of applause rippled through the room. Selene clapped along with the rest of them, the sound hollow and foreign to her own ears. Victor strode onto the stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight, the very picture of a benevolent, powerful man. He looked out at the audience, his eyes sweeping across the sea of adoring faces, and for a heart-stopping moment, his gaze met Selene's. There was no warmth in his eyes, no shared intimacy. It was a look of cold calculation, a silent warning. Then his gaze shifted, moving past her to the table just beyond, where Juliana sat, watching him with an expression of rapt adoration. She lifted her champagne flute in a small, almost imperceptible toast, a gesture of shared victory that was meant only for him. But Selene saw it, and in that moment, she understood. This entire night, this grand performance, wasn't for the charity or for their reputation. It was for Juliana. It was a display of power, a demonstration of the world he could offer her, a world that Selene was now merely an obstacle in. Victor began his speech, his voice resonating through the ballroom, smooth and persuasive. He spoke of legacy, of community, of building a better future for the next generation. As he spoke the words, "the next generation," he paused and a tender smile touched his lips. He looked directly at Selene, and for a dizzying, hopeful second, she thought he was going to acknowledge her, to acknowledge their child. But his gaze was a lie. "My wife, Selene," he said, his voice dripping with feigned affection as he gestured towards her, "embodies that future. Her strength and grace as she prepares to bring our child into this world is a constant inspiration." The audience cooed, their applause a wave of warm approval. Selene felt a flush of shame and humiliation. It was all a lie, a beautifully crafted piece of theater for a willing audience. She was his prop, and he was using her and their unborn child to sell his image of the perfect family man. As the applause died down, Victor continued, "It is in that spirit of family and future that I am thrilled to announce a new initiative within my company, a program designed to mentor and empower the next generation of leaders." He paused for dramatic effect. "And I have found the perfect person to lead this initiative, a woman whose brilliance, dedication, and vision have already become invaluable to me. Please join me in congratulating the new Vice President of Strategic Development, Ms. Juliana Thorne." A spotlight swiveled, illuminating Juliana at her table. She rose, a picture of blushing, humble surprise, though Selene could see the triumphant glint in her eyes. The promotion was a public anointing, a declaration. He was elevating his mistress, placing her on a pedestal for the entire world to see, right in front of his pregnant wife. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a slap in the face, not just to Selene, but to the sanctity of their marriage, to the life she carried within her. The room erupted in applause, a deafening roar that felt like a physical assault. Selene felt the blood drain from her face. This was Juliana's mockery made manifest, her cruel whispers amplified into a public coronation. She looked from Victor, beaming on the stage, to Juliana, accepting the congratulations of those around her. and she felt a rage so pure, so potent, it burned away the last vestiges of her fear. But the true unveiling was yet to come. As Juliana milked her moment, Victor's speech continued, but his tone shifted. It became more personal, more somber. Success, or he said, his voice now lower, more intimate, often comes at a cost. It requires sacrifice. Sometimes it requires you to reevaluate the very foundations of your life, to ask yourself if the path you are on is truly the path to happiness. Selene's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. She knew with a chilling certainty that this was not part of the pre-approved speech she had read earlier that week. Growth, he continued, requires letting go. It means having the courage to admit when something is no longer working, no matter how difficult it may be. He looked out into the audience, his eyes finding Selene's once more. This time, there was no pretense, no warning, only a cold, chilling finality. It means closing one chapter of your life, he said, his voice ringing with a terrible clarity, so that you can begin another. And as he spoke those words, a man in a crisp, dark suit approached her table. He moved with a quiet, unobtrusive efficiency that made him almost invisible in the grand ballroom. He leaned down, his voice a polite, professional murmur that was only for her. "Mrs. Blackwood?" She looked up at him, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "I have a delivery for you," he said, and placed a thick manila envelope on the pristine white tablecloth in front of her. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The name of a prestigious law firm was embossed in the corner. Her fingers, clumsy and numb, fumbled with the seal. She pulled out the documents, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. But one word, one phrase leaped out at her, stark and brutal against the page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The breath left her body in a ragged, silent scream. The room, the lights, the faces, they all dissolved into a meaningless, swirling blur. The only thing in focus was Victor, standing on that stage, bathed in the spotlight, his face a mask of serene, righteous control. He had just delivered a moving speech about family and the future, all while having his pregnant wife served with divorce papers in a room full of their peers. The cruelty, the sheer, theatrical malevolence of it, was a physical blow. The unveiling was complete. He had not just revealed his affair, he had unveiled his soulless, monstrous heart. The world narrowed to a single, sharp point of focus. The crisp, heavy paper in her hands and the man on the stage who had just detonated her life. The roar of the applause for Juliana's promotion faded into a distant, buzzing static. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the strains of the string quartet. It was all a soundtrack to a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Selene's mind raced, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. Divorce. The word was an obscenity, a violent intrusion into the sacred space of her marriage, her family, her future. Her gaze lifted from the documents, drawn inexorably back to Victor. He was still speaking, his voice calm and measured, as if he hadn't just committed the most public, most brutal act of emotional violence imaginable. He was wrapping up his speech, thanking the donors, smiling his charming, benevolent smile. He was a performer, and this was his masterpiece. He had orchestrated every detail, from Juliana's promotion to the precise, humiliating moment the papers would be delivered. He wanted to destroy her, not just leave her. He wanted to strip her of her dignity, to annihilate her in the court of public opinion before she even had a chance to fight back. A wave of icy calm washed over her, the kind of preternatural stillness that precedes a devastating storm. The shock gave way to a cold, hard fury. The fear, the hurt, the years of quiet desperation, they all coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of resolve. He would not break her. He would not turn her into a tragic, pitiful figure for gossip columns. He had chosen the stage for his final act, and so she would choose it for hers. As Victor finished his speech to a final thunderous round of applause, Selene pushed back her chair. The sudden movement drew the attention of those at her table. Catherine, the acquaintance from the powder room, reached out a hand. "Selene, are you all right? You're white as a sheet." Selene didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the stage, on the man who was now shaking hands with the gala's organizers, accepting their praise. She clutched the divorce papers in her hand, the sharp edges of the envelope digging into her palm. She walked toward the stage, her movements slow, deliberate, each step an act of defiance. The crowd began to part before her, a sea of confused, curious faces. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom as people realized something was wrong. The pregnant wife of the keynote speaker was walking toward the stage, her face a mask of cold, controlled rage. Victor saw her. His smile faltered, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He had expected tears, a quiet, dignified retreat, a scene in the privacy of their home. He had not expected this. He had not expected her to fight back. Not here, not now. He took a step forward, as if to intercept her, his hand outstretched, a placating gesture. "Selene, darling, what is it?" His voice, amplified by the microphone still clipped to his lapel, boomed through the ballroom, laced with a false, patronizing concern. She ignored his outstretched hand, mounting the low steps to the stage with a grace she didn't know she possessed. She walked directly to the podium, where he stood, and turned to face the audience. The ballroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were fixed on her, on the dramatic, unexpected tableau unfolding before them. She took the microphone from its stand, her hand surprisingly steady. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a power that silenced even the faintest whisper. "My husband, Victor Blackwood, is a man of many talents. He is a brilliant businessman, a captivating speaker, and a generous philanthropist." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. She turned her head slightly, her eyes finding Victor's. He was frozen, his face pale, his mask of control finally cracking. "But tonight," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in, "he has revealed his greatest talent of all, his gift for theater." She held up the manila envelope, the divorce papers, for the entire room to see. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. "Just moments ago, as he spoke to you of family, of legacy, and of the future, he had this delivered to me. His vision for the future, it seems, does not include me or the child I carry." She looked from the shocked faces in the audience to Juliana, who sat at her table, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by the horrified realization that the game had turned against her. "He spoke of courage," Selene's voice rose, trembling now, not with weakness, but with a righteous, unyielding anger. "The courage to let go when something isn't working. But this is not courage. This is cowardice. This is cruelty. To humiliate me, to humiliate our unborn child, in front of all of you. This is the act of a man with no honor, no decency, no soul." Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and silent. But they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of grief for the man she had once loved, for the marriage she had fought for the dream that had been so brutally murdered on this public stage. "So I will accept my husband's generous gift," she said, her voice thick with emotion but unwavering. She looked directly at Victor, whose face was a mixture of shock, rage, and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. Was it fear? "I will accept this petition for divorce, but I will not be a victim in your play, Victor. I will not be the quiet, tragic wife you discard when she is no longer convenient. This is not your stage anymore. It is mine." With a final defiant look at the man who had been her husband, she turned and walked off the stage. She did not look back. She walked through the silent, stunned crowd, her head held high, the divorce papers clutched in her hand like a declaration of independence. The gilded cage had been shattered, and though she was walking into an unknown, terrifying future, for the first time in a very long time, she was free. The climax was not his public betrayal, but her public reclamation of her own story. The ballroom remained in a state of suspended shock, the echoes of her words hanging in the air long after she was gone. The silence Selene left in her wake was more profound than any applause. It was a thick, heavy blanket of shock and disbelief that smothered the glittering atmosphere of the gala. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Then the whispers began, a low, insidious hiss that quickly grew into a roar of scandalized chatter. Cameras flashed, capturing Victor's frozen, ashen face, and Juliana's, which was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The perfect evening, their moment of triumph, had imploded into a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. Selene didn't hear it. The moment she stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool, quiet marble lobby, the world went numb. The adrenaline that had propelled her onto the stage, that had given her the strength to speak her truth, drained away, leaving her hollow and trembling. A hotel doorman, his face a mixture of concern and pity, rushed to her side. "Ma'am, are you all right? Can I call you a cab?" She nodded, unable to speak, the words caught in a painful lump in her throat. As she waited leaning against a pillar for support, she saw Catherine rush out of the ballroom, her husband trailing nervously behind her. "Selene, my God, are you all right?" Catherine's voice was filled with a genuine concern that cut through the fog of Selene's shock. She wrapped a surprisingly strong arm around Selene's shoulders. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen, and the most despicable thing I have ever seen him do." She shot a venomous glare back towards the ballroom doors. "Come with us. You can't be alone tonight." For the first time that night, Selene didn't feel completely isolated. She allowed Catherine to guide her to her car, a quiet, safe space away from the prying eyes and flashing cameras. The drive was silent, Selene staring unseeingly at the blur of city lights, the divorce papers a cold, heavy weight in her lap. Catherine and her husband exchanged worried glances, but respected her silence, offering a quiet, unobtrusive presence that was more comforting than any words could be. They took her to their home, a warm, elegant brownstone that felt a world away from the cold, sterile mansion she had shared with Victor. Catherine led her to a guest room, brought her a glass of water and a warm blanket, and simply sat with her as the first racking sobs began to tear through her. The grief was a physical entity, a monstrous weight on her chest, and she cried until she was empty, until there were no tears left to shed. Meanwhile, back at the gala, chaos reigned. Victor was quickly surrounded by his security team, who hustled him out a side exit, shielding him from the reporters who had descended like vultures. He was silent, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He had lost control, the one thing he valued above all else. Selene had defied him, had stripped him of his power in the most public way possible. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and the only emotion he could register was a cold, blinding fury. Juliana was not so lucky. As the new vice president, she was now a public figure, and she was left to face the fallout alone. The congratulations she had received just moments before had turned to looks of pity and contempt. She was no longer the brilliant, ambitious protégé. She was the other woman, the homewrecker, the villain in a drama that was now the talk of the city. Her triumph had turned to ash in her mouth. She tried to maintain her composure, to hold her head high, but the whispers and stares were relentless. She had wanted to be Victor's queen, but in his attempt to dethrone Selene, he had only succeeded in branding her with a scarlet letter. In the car on the way to his empty mansion, Victor's rage finally found its voice. He smashed his fist against the leather seat, the sound a dull thud in the silent car. He called his lawyer, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "She has to pay for this. I want to destroy her. I want her to walk away with nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing." His lawyer, a man accustomed to Victor's ruthlessness, advised caution. "Victor, this is a PR disaster. Serving her at the gala was a mistake. She has the sympathy of the public now. We need to be careful." "I don't pay you to be careful," Victor roared. "I pay you to win. Now fix it." He ended the call, the silence in the car once again amplifying his fury. He had underestimated Selene. He had seen her as a fragile, dependent creature, a beautiful object he could control and discard at will. He had forgotten the fire he had once admired in her, the strength he had worked so hard to extinguish over the years. By pushing her to the brink, he had inadvertently reignited it. In the quiet guest room of Catherine's home, Selene finally fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. When she awoke, the morning sun was streaming through the windows, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memories of the previous night came crashing back, a tidal wave of pain and humiliation. But something was different. The despair was still there, a dull ache in the center of her chest, but it was accompanied by a flicker of something else, resolve. Catherine brought her a cup of tea, her expression gentle. The story is everywhere, she said softly, placing a tablet on the bedside table. Selene picked it up, her hand trembling. The headlines were sensational, splashed across every news outlet. Blackwood divorce drama explodes at charity gala. Mistress mocked, wife fights back. Millionaire's public betrayal. They had painted her as a woman scorned, but also as a woman of incredible strength. The comment sections, usually a cesspool of vitriol, were overwhelmingly in her favor. People were calling Victor a monster, Juliana a homewrecker, and Selene a hero. She had expected to be an object of pity, but instead, she had become a symbol of defiance. Her public humiliation had, paradoxically, become her greatest weapon. She had taken control of the narrative, and in doing so, had exposed Victor's cruelty for all the world to see. She placed her hand on her belly, the baby kicking gently as if in response. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, the words a promise to both her child and herself. The road ahead would be difficult, a brutal legal battle against a man with unlimited resources and a thirst for revenge. But the fear that had held her captive for so long was gone. The aftermath of the storm was devastating, but in the wreckage of her old life, she could see the foundations of a new one, a life she would build on her own terms, a life of strength, independence, and finally, peace. The battle had just begun, but for the first time, she believed she could win. The weeks that followed the gala were a blur of legal meetings, media frenzy, and quiet, determined planning. Victor, true to his word, unleashed the full force of his legal team, attempting to bury Selene in a mountain of paperwork and intimidation tactics. His initial divorce filing was a work of fiction, painting her as an unstable, emotionally volatile gold digger, and himself as the long-suffering husband who had finally been pushed too far. He tried to freeze her assets, cancel her credit cards, and evict her from the only home she had ever known with him, all while leaking salacious, untrue rumors to the press. It was a classic Victor Blackwood strategy, overwhelming force and a scorched earth policy. But he was fighting a different Selene now. The woman who had once been cowed by his anger was now fueled by it. With Catherine's help, she found a lawyer, a sharp, compassionate woman named Anya Sharma, who specialized in high-conflict divorces. "He wants to make you a villain," Anya said during their first meeting, her office a calm, orderly space that felt like a fortress. "Our job is to make sure the world sees the truth. You already started that process on the stage. Now we finish it in the courtroom." Anya's strategy was not to fight fire with fire, but with quiet, irrefutable truth. They began the painstaking process of documenting Victor's financial and emotional abuse. They subpoenaed phone records, company expense reports, and emails. They found proof of the lavish gifts he had bestowed upon Juliana, the secret trips they had taken, all paid for with marital funds. Every lie, every deception was slowly, meticulously unraveled. Selene, meanwhile, focused on building a new life. She moved out of the cold, cavernous mansion and, with a loan from Catherine, found a small, charming apartment in a quiet neighborhood. For the first time in years, she was surrounded by her own things, her own choices. She painted the walls a warm, sunny yellow, bought a comfortable rocking chair for the nursery, and started attending a prenatal yoga class. Each small act of independence was a victory, a reclamation of the self she had lost. The media attention was relentless, but she refused to engage. She did not give interviews, did not issue statements. Her silence became a powerful counterpoint to the slander being peddled by Victor's camp. Her public image, forged in that single defiant act at the gala, remained that of a dignified, wronged woman who was focused on the well-being of her child. For Victor, the reckoning was swift and brutal. The public sympathy for Selene translated into a public backlash against him. His company's stock took a hit. Powerful women on several corporate boards he was a part of called for his resignation. The morality clause in several lucrative contracts was invoked. The benevolent family man image he had spent years and millions of dollars cultivating was shattered overnight. He was no longer seen as a charismatic titan of industry, but as a cruel, narcissistic bully. He saw the consequences most clearly in the eyes of his own father, a stern, old-school patriarch who valued honor above all else. "You have brought shame to this family," his father told him during a tense, final meeting. You didn't just divorce your wife. You tried to destroy the mother of your child. There is no honor in that. There is only weakness." The words were a blow from which Victor's ego could not recover. Juliana too faced her own reckoning. The coveted vice president position became a poisoned chalice. Her colleagues ostracized her, her authority was undermined at every turn, and she became the butt of every office joke. The power and prestige she had craved were now inextricably linked to the scandal. She had won the man, but she had lost the respect and the career she had sacrificed everything for. The strain began to show. The triumphant confidence was replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. Her relationship with Victor, once a passionate, clandestine affair, became a toxic partnership of shared resentment and blame. The turning point for Selene came during a routine deposition. Victor's lawyer, a smug, aggressive man, was grilling her about her past, trying to paint her as mentally unstable by bringing up the fire that had ended her first engagement. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Blackwood," he sneered, "that you have a history of volatile relationships ending in dramatic fashion?" Before Anya could object, Selene answered, her voice steady. "The fire was ruled an accident, but it taught me a valuable lesson. It taught me how it feels to lose everything. It taught me the difference between a house and a home, and it taught me that you can rebuild from the ashes." She looked directly at Victor, who sat at the other end of the long conference table. "And that is exactly what I am doing." In that moment, Victor saw her, not as the fragile girl he had rescued, not as the compliant wife he had controlled, but as a woman of immense, quiet strength. He saw a flicker of the girl he had first fallen in love with, the girl whose fire he had found so captivating before he had tried to extinguish it. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, of regret, pierced through his armor of rage and arrogance. He had set out to destroy her, but he was beginning to realize he had only succeeded in destroying himself. Weeks later, Anya received a call. Victor wanted to settle. His initial offer was still insulting, but it was a sign that the fight had gone out of him. The war was over. Selene's rebirth was quiet, not triumphant. It was the peace she felt as she assembled a crib in the nursery. It was the joy of feeling her baby kick as she read a book in her sun-drenched living room. It was the strength she found in the friendship of women like Catherine and Anya. She had walked through fire not for the first time, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and utterly, completely her own. The divorce was just a legal process. Her freedom, she realized, had been declared long ago, on that stage when she had finally found her voice. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the city in new colors, and with them, Selene's life transformed. The scandal, once a raging inferno, had dwindled to embers, a piece of city lore that was occasionally reignited in gossip columns, but had lost its power to burn her. Her divorce was finalized, the settlement fair and just, a testament to Anya's skill and Selene's unwavering resolve. But the true victory was not financial. It was the quiet, steady peace that had settled into her soul. Her apartment, once a temporary sanctuary, had become a home, filled with the scent of baby powder and the soft gurgles of her son, Leo. He was a beautiful baby, with Selene's calm, curious eyes and a fuzz of dark hair that promised to be as unruly as Victor's. He was the center of her universe, the sun around which her new life joyfully orbited. Selene had discovered a strength and resourcefulness she never knew she possessed. She had started a small online consulting business, helping nonprofits with their fundraising and event planning, using the skills she had honed during her years as a corporate wife for a purpose that felt meaningful. It wasn't the glamorous, high-powered world she had once inhabited, but it was hers, built with her own hands on her own terms. She found joy in the small things: a walk in the park with Leo strapped to her chest, coffee with Catherine, the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work. The gilded cage felt like a distant, half-forgotten dream. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she pushed Leo's stroller through a park rustling with gold and crimson leaves, she saw him. Victor was sitting on a bench, staring out at the small pond, a solitary figure in a world he had once commanded. He looked different. The sharp, tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple sweater and slacks. There were lines of fatigue around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his shoulders, once so broad and confident, were slumped in a posture of defeat. Her first instinct was to turn, to walk away, to protect the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed. But then he looked up, and his eyes met hers. There was no anger in his gaze, no arrogance, only a deep, profound sadness. He didn't approach her, but gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement, a concession. Hesitantly, she walked towards him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. She stopped a few feet from the bench. "Hello, Victor," she said, her voice even, devoid of the anger and pain that had once consumed her. "Selene," he replied, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. His eyes flickered to the stroller, to the small, sleeping face of his son. A look of such intense regret and longing passed over his face that it was almost painful to witness. "He's beautiful." "Yes," she said simply, "he is." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with the ghosts of what they had been, and the vast, unbridgeable chasm of what they had become. "I saw that you sold the company," she said, breaking the silence. It had been headline news a few months ago. Victor Blackwood, the Titan, had sold his empire and disappeared from public life. He nodded, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the water. "It wasn't mine anymore. Not really. The name was tarnished." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "I tarnished it. I destroyed it. Just like I destroyed everything else." He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with an emotion he had never seen in him before. Genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Selene, for everything, for the way I treated you, for what I did to you, to us, for that night. There is no excuse. It was monstrous. I became a monster." Selene listened, her heart surprisingly calm. A year ago, these were the words she had desperately longed to hear. Now they were just words, an epitaph for a love that had long since died. "The thing I regret the most," he continued, his voice cracking, "is that I will never know him, my son, and that is a punishment I have earned, a life sentence." She looked from Victor's broken form to the peaceful, sleeping face of her child. She thought of forgiveness, not as a gift to him, but as a final, liberating act for herself. Holding on to the hatred would only tether her to the past, a past she had worked so hard to escape. "One day when he is older," she said, the words coming to her slowly, "I will tell him about his father, and if he wants to meet you then, that will be his choice." It wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was a flicker of grace, a possibility of a future that wasn't entirely defined by the bitterness of the past. A single tear rolled down Victor's cheek. "Thank you," he whispered. She gave a small nod, and without another word she turned and continued her walk, pushing the stroller deeper into the vibrant heart of the park. The sun was warm on her face, and the sound of children's laughter drifted on the breeze. A new dawn had broken, not with a fiery, triumphant sunrise, but with the quiet, gentle light of a peaceful autumn afternoon. She was no longer a wife, scorned or otherwise. She was Selene. She was a mother, and she was finally, blessedly, free. As Selene walked away, leaving her past sitting on a park bench, she embraced a future of her own making. She chose grace over bitterness, strength over victimhood. Now we ask you, what would you have done in her place? Would you have sought revenge, forgiveness, or simply walked away and never looked back?